Okay, thank you, Anna, for joining us on Eerie Earth tonight. Could we just start by telling our listeners just a little bit about yourself and what you do with Old Reiki Tours?
I'm a guide for Old Reiki Tours. I've been with them for about a year now. And we take people on tours down at the Niddry Street Vaults. We also take people to Greyfriars Graveyard, and we take people around the streets of the Old Town of Edinburgh.
Okay. And do you head into the Southbridge Vaults as well, or is that?
Yes, we go into the Southbridge Vaults, the Niddry Street side.
Yeah.
We have a section of vaults down there that are privately owned. And the vaults include a genuine witch's coven down there that was owned by a gentleman called George Cameron, aka the Hermit. So he owned that witch's coven. He rented the vault off the owner of the vaults. So he practiced down there with his witches. And a lesser known fact about that particular coven is they had the first witch wedding in the UK down there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's still intact. It looks like I mean, they've not used it for several years now, after the high priest George Cameron died. But it's as it was. It's still intact and it's set for ritual, and it just looks like they walked away from it yesterday. It's a bit like a time capsule. It's really impressive, but you can now see it starting to go a bit stagnant and a bit mouldy down there, which really just adds to the effect. It's now covered in cobwebs and things like that. So that's a really impressive vault.
Lovely. And
We
and do they get a lot of activity down with, obviously, with the witches? They might have conjured quite a lot of energy. Do they get a lot of activity in there?
Yeah, down the vaults, there is an awful lot of paranormal activity. It's regarded one of the most haunted places in the UK. We have several regular spirits down there that are frequently sighted. And what's interesting from a guide's perspective is we go down there frequently, every night, and we go down with different people, and without us prompting it, people see similar things in similar places and report very similar activity and occurrences down there. There was actually quite a major incident regarding the Witches' Coven. They started off renting a vault that was further up the subterranean street than the one that they later hired, and the owner of the coven, George Cameron, um, decided to spend the night in that coven down the vault alone one night
Wow.
to try
He's
and
brave.
understand. Very, very brave. You wouldn't catch me doing that. He decided to spend the night down there alone to try and figure out what was happening in regards to this unexplained reoccurring paranormal activity. Now, what was happening was people were going into that chamber, into that vault, and experiencing poltergeist-like activity. They could feel themselves being pushed. They could feel like restrictions around their neck. They could feel a very sort of malevolent presence in the room. Pools of stagnant water would just appear for no explicable reason, and they would leave the vaults, lock up because there was a gate across the front of the chamber, leave the vaults, come back in the next day, and things had been thrown around the room and knocked off shelves. And nobody should have been in there. Nothing should have been causing that activity. So that's when George decided that he was going to spend the night to try and work out what was going on, while they weren't there. He set up his little camp in the middle of the stone circle that we have in that room. It's meant to be a protected circle. He decided to spend the night in that particular circle, and he managed to fall asleep. After a few hours, he was woken by a very loud thump. He could hear footsteps. He could hear rattling. He could hear laughter. He could hear people running up and down the corridor outside the vault. And he then was subject to a poltergeist attack. He could feel himself being pushed and shoved. It absolutely terrified the life out of the man. He shot out of there. The next day, he told the owner of the vaults what had happened, and just basically said, don't let anybody else back inside that particular chamber, because whatever it is that goes on down those vaults seems to manifest itself in that particular chamber. He then packed up his stuff and moved further down the corridor in the vaults into this new chamber that was much closer to the door.
Wow, that's quite a lot of quite terrifying stuff to happen to someone, especially when you're on your own in there.
Yeah. And we do now still take our visitors into that particular chamber. But we tell people not to stand inside the stone circle, but to stand on the outside of the stone circle, because George, he went in there one last time to pack up all his stuff. He stood in the middle of the circle and he reversed the cycle. So any negative energy would be trapped inside the stone circle. And there's a pattern. If anybody gets inside the stone circle, things tend to happen to them. Now, during tours, that particular room, if anything is going to happen to anyone, it tends to be in that particular chamber. So if anybody's going to react, if anyone's going to start feeling sick or feeling faint or feeling emotional or feeling some kind of paranormal occurrence, it tends to be in that particular room, especially if people get inside the stone circle.
And you find you get a lot of activity with the visitors quite often, or is it?
We do. We hear footsteps quite frequently. And we hear very loud bangs down there that we haven't actually got an explanation for. There's lots of thumping and rattling down there. And a lot of people report sightings of, there's one particular spirit called the Watcher down there. And we believe that he was a slum landlord for the vaults, because the vaults used to be a notorious slum back in the 1800s, and he was a slum landlord, and he still thinks that he owns the place, basically, that he is watching out down the vaults. He doesn't like intruders, and he has a habit of trying to frighten people out of the vaults. You will hear a very loud get out. A lot of people have seen a very tall gentleman in a long black cloak, long hair. He's got very sort of vile whiskey breath, and he rattles keys. One thing that everybody has in common who has sighted the Watcher is that nobody's been able to describe his face for varying reasons. Either his face is totally blacked out, or he has his back to people, or he seems to be wearing some kind of mask. He's basically, his face is hidden, so it's almost as if he doesn't want to be identified. So very, very frequently people have cited that and heard. He gets nicknamed Mr. Boots as well, because often his manifestation is very loud footsteps accompanied by keys, and then that often precedes a sighting of the Watcher.
Have you ever seen him yourself?
I had one occurrence where I said goodbye to everybody at the end of a tour. It was the last tour of the night, and us tour guides have the very unenviable task of having to go in at the end of the last tour into the vaults and blow out all the candles. So it's very nerve-wracking. So we have to go the length and breadth of the vaults and blow out these candles. So I went up the top end of the corridor, blew out all the candles, started walking back down, looked down the bottom end of the vaults, and it seemed to be the light was sort of strange. It wasn't as it was 10 minutes ago, and I could have sworn there was a couple of candles still lit down there, and I could look down. It looked like it was illuminated, but I couldn't see the candles lit. The next thing, something very hastily moved towards me, and I could then see the candles again. I shot out the vault, went down, got the person that works in the office, came back up, told him what had happened, looked down the corridor, nobody around, nobody down the vault, and you could still see that two candles were lit.
Wow. That's quite terrifying. Again, especially when you're on your own, that can, be very, very frightening.
It really does. If something happens, it really does shake you up for a while, and you really don't want to go back down there. You kind of you go back in to blow the candles out in twos after that for a while.
I guess when you're with visitors, you have to kind of create this persona of where you're this brave explorer of the vault. So if something happens, you've got to refrain from screaming and running out of there.
Absolutely. But quite often the guides can get more of a fright than the visitors can get, because if they hear footsteps or they hear like an eerie sound coming from up the corridor or something like that, they potentially think that's some kind of jumper outer, or they potentially think that it's some kind of sound effect that we've created or something like that. But as guides, we know what should and shouldn't be happening. And quite often people have heard something up the other end of the vaults and they're like, who's up there? And I'm like, well, nobody's up there. We're entirely alone. And they don't believe me. They think there's somebody up there making the shuffling sounds. So I will take them up there, and you just see the colour drain from their faces when they realise that there's no other way out, and there's nobody else in the vaults that could possibly be making that noise.
So if they see you run, they have to run faster.
Well, I think fear's quite contagious. And if they see the person that's facilitating the tour starting to get a bit of a fright, I think it sort of sets them off a little bit as well.
Yeah, it can add to the atmosphere as well, I guess, though.
It absolutely adds to the atmosphere. As soon as you walk into the vaults, there's just a thick atmosphere. There's a very oppressive feeling to the vaults. It's so atmospheric. At one time, it was absolutely teeming with life. It was, like I said, it was a notorious slum. It was actually built for the merchants of Edinburgh that had properties above ground, and this was their storerooms and it was their workshops. But the vaults are actually made out of a viaduct bridge that's been encased in buildings, 19 massive arches that's then been divided up into 120 vaults, and this is what the merchants used. This was the plan originally, but because the bridge was built out of limestone, it's very, very porous, and there's a constant water ingress. So this was no good for the merchants. It was destroying their stock, so they moved out. When they moved out, the homeless and the destitute moved in, because it was illegal to be homeless in Edinburgh. It was actually punishable by death. If you were caught lying out in the streets, you were just regarded a nuisance. You were vagrant. You would be branded on the cheek with a V for vagrant to start with. If you still didn't learn your lesson, you were taken to the Market Cross and you were flogged. If that didn't work, you were just regarded a nuisance and you'd be hung for it. So these people didn't have a choice but to go and live in these vaults, and they were horrendous. The conditions were awful. It was basically, it looks a bit like a sewer, and you've got this constant water ingress. There's no sanitation, no running water, no toilets. So people just basically lived in filth. You'd be up to your ankles in it. Disease was absolutely rife in this place, massively overcrowded, and they were quite often plunged into complete darkness. It was pitch black down there. They often didn't have candles because they couldn't afford to eat, so they couldn't afford candles. So it was jet black. The conditions were horrendous. And in addition to that, there was an awful lot of vice. There was a lot of illegal businesses down there, and there's lots of evidence, lots of bric-a-brac and things were found when the vaults were rediscovered. There was evidence of gentlemen's clubs, gentlemen in inverted commas, occultist clubs. There was evidence of illegal breweries. We actually found an intact still down there that was used to still illegal alcohol, and then they were sold in illegal taverns down there. There was brothels. There was gambling dens. There was dogfighting pits. There was all kinds of stuff. It was even a place for body snatchers and serial killers to store their deceased victims before they would be taken off to the anatomy schools and sold. So there was so much activity down this place. It got so bad that the authorities closed the vaults down. They bricked up all the doorways and just locked down the vaults. In time, the vaults just got completely forgotten about.
Wow.
And it wasn't until the 1970s. Now they were shut down about the 1860s. Fast forward 110 years, they sat abandoned. Fast forward about 100 to about the 1970s. The tenement blocks that encased the vaults, one of the apartments was a student's flat, and the students were in their sitting room, and they were messing around with a football, and they were bouncing it off one of the walls. They noticed that one section of the wall was more hollow sounding than the rest of the room. So they got very curious as to what was behind this wall. They went out and got a sledgehammer, and they came back and they bashed at the part of the wall that sounded hollow. They found a bricked up doorway, knocked it through, and they rediscovered the vaults after them being buried and forgotten about for 110 years.
Wow. That's certainly impressive. Certainly impressive find behind the wall of your of your student digs.
You basically walk, because we take people through the student's flat and through the sitting room and into the vaults, and you basically step out into the subterranean streets.
Wow.
It's mad. It's like Narnia. It's like walking through the wardrobe.
Yeah.
It's absolutely the last thing you would expect to be at the back of your sitting room wall.
Now, I've heard rumor, I'm not sure if the legend's true, but it's the legend of one Madame Violet, who was a supposed vampire or had a vampire cult and used the vaults as kind of her headquarters. Is that a legend that's true, or?
That's not one that I'm familiar with.
Oh, okay.
That's not
It's
what I'm familiar with.
it's one that I did when doing some research, came across it, and there's not a lot of information about it, but apparently she used the vaults for her cult of people who were following her. She was a medium, and apparently she drank their blood to get closer to the spirits, and she used the vaults as their sort of hideout for this illegal cult that they were doing.
Oh,
But
it wouldn't surprise me. There was lots of occultist groups that used to use the vaults, and in one of our chambers, we actually have what looks like an old altar that was in situ when we found it, and we've never really worked out exactly what this altar would have been used for, but it's a very distinct looking altar. On the other side, we're the Niddry Street vaults. On the other side of the South Bridge vaults, there is another tour company called Mercat Tours. So this lady that you're talking about might have been in the other side.
might have been, yeah, might have been. You get thousands of visitors to the vaults every year. What do you think makes the vaults so appealing? Do you think it's the hauntings, the histories, or the fact that it's somewhere that you can't get to every single day?
I think it's probably a combination of all those things. I mean, we have so many unique things about those vaults. I mean, it's just very strange. Edinburgh has quite a notorious underground and underworld. So the reason for that is because the city of Edinburgh was built within city walls, and it was very, very cramped. People were too scared to build and live outside the city walls, so everybody cramped inside. And as populations grew, people couldn't build out the way, so they built up the way. And they built down the way as well. So we actually have a very impressive underground in Edinburgh. There's lots of hidden streets, and there's lots of hidden chambers and vaults and things like that. A lot of these places haven't actually been excavated yet. So I think it's just a very, very curious place and really quite unique. And the activity and things that went on in these places. We've got one particular area of our vaults. Now, before the bridge was built, there was 3 streets where the bridge now stands: People's Wynd, Marlin's Wynd, and Niddry's Wynd. Those streets were demolished to make way for this bridge being built, and beneath our vaults, we have the remains of Nicol Edwards's house. Now, Nicol Edwards was the Provost of Scotland for King James, Mary Queen of Scots' son. The remains of his house are directly beneath our vaults.
Oh, wow.
Now, Yeah. Now, had you heard of Nicol Edwards?
No, I hadn't. I've heard of the vaults before, but I wasn't aware there was anything underneath them.
Absolutely. It's now some of these parts of the vaults have been excavated, some of them haven't. But this particular site, Nicol Edwards' house, he was the provost, like I said, and in the basement of his house, we know from documents and blueprints and things, he had cells. There's 13 cells in his house, in the basement of his house, that are still intact underneath the bridge. He used those cells to imprison witches. James I was, he despised witches, and he was responsible for much of the witch persecutions in Edinburgh. And when he translated the King James Bible, he entered Exodus 22:18, "Thou shalt not tolerate a witch to live." And there was a famous trial in Edinburgh called the North Berwick Witch Trials. And Shakespeare based Macbeth off these witch trials. So very notorious witch trials at the hands of King James. Nicol Edward was his provost. Some of the witch trials happened in Nicol Edwards' house in the basement.
Oh,
In the
wow.
basement of his house in these cells. And the torture was carried out to try to get a confession out of these witches. They were imprisoned there, and they were sometimes executed there. They would be taken from these cells to Holyrood Palace. They would be convicted, and then they'd be taken up to the castle to be burned at the stake for witchcraft. So we have that directly underneath our vaults. And the owner of the vaults is looking to excavate those chambers and excavate what remains of Nicol Edwards' house.
Wow, that'd be
And
certainly
it
an
hasn't.
awesome addition.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it hasn't been looked at since the streets were demolished for the bridge to be built. So nobody has seen those basements, those cells, since the bridge was built in 1788.
Wow, so the cells could potentially still be there then.
They're probably still there.
Wow, that would be incredible.
There used to the pub on the site that's now called Banshee Labyrinth, but prior to that it was called Nicol Edwards after the provost.
Oh, wow. That's certainly something that I didn't know and hadn't found out in my research or anything about. That's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you think, obviously, the whole world's been on lockdown recently, but do you think that will have an effect on the supposed paranormal activity that goes down in the vaults with the lack of visitors and lack of energy that's going on down there? Do you think perhaps the activity will either intensify, or do you think it will quiet down since it's been locked down?
Well, I'm going to find out in about 2 hours, because I'm taking our first tour down there since lockdown.
Wow, okay.
So we will see what happens. I'm suspecting it's probably going to have an effect on the activity down there. I think if anything, it's probably going to heighten it. The Watcher has probably got used to having his vaults back to himself. He doesn't like intruders at the best of times, so he's maybe just got used to peace and quiet. And we're going to be going back in there tonight, and we're going to be disturbing his peace. So we'll see how he reacts to it.
You'll have to make sure that you really wind him up to try and get some activity.
Yeah, well, just our very presence there is probably going to wind him up, I think.
So when does the vaults reopen officially then?
So the vaults reopen officially on the 4th of September. So we're doing a couple of little private tours at the moment, but we will be fully fledged as from the 4th of September.
Fantastic. And obviously, when you do go reopen, where can people find information, and where can they book tickets and things like that if they wanted to head down?
Well, we're all over social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and TripAdvisor. And they can also visit our website, www.alldrakeytours.com, and they can book through our website.
Fantastic. Well, Anna, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been really great hearing all the stories, and
thanks for having me.
I hope you stay safe, and I hope the tour goes very well tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You take care.
Thanks. Bye.